everyone. I'm April Beaver. I'm the Director of Digital Media here at First Reformed Church, and I'm here with Pastor Tim, who did our second message with Clash of Kingdoms series, and it was all about Daniel chapter 3, about message on conformity.
Yeah, the fiery furnace story.
Right.
Yep.
So with that, those three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they did not bow down when requested and were thrown into the fiery furnace. And why don't you tell us maybe just a nugget or two to start off with that you wish you had time to say, but you just didn't, it didn't make the cut on Sunday.
Thank you. Well, I told you, April, that there's a whole bunch that kind of had to hit the cutting room floor from this message because such a rich, such a deep kind of passage. One of the areas I really wanted to explore was this contrast between the image of gold and the image of God. So it's the very same word for image, which is the Hebrew word selim. And one of the ideas behind the commandment not to make a graven image for God's people going back to Moses was that they had a more fundamental image. They had the image of God stamped on them. You do not need to create a 90 feet high statue or even a 9-inch high statue because you meet God not in forged metal or carved stone. You meet God in other people. Everyone has the image of God in them. And I think also it's almost a poetic kind of contrast, the image of gold, image of God. And they were called not to fall down before an image of gold, a selim of gold, because within them, they were bearers of the image of God. And so I really like that. That's just one of several things I kind of wish we had more time to talk about.
That is really good. It also made me, when you were talking about, think about how you talked about that furnace. And many times it was stamped with the image of Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, the bricks, yeah.
Yeah, and so it almost makes you contrast that a little bit too, where they were sent into the furnace to be stamped with something other than the image of God, but that didn't happen. They walked out.
I happen to think Nebuchadnezzar never believed he was going to have to use it. He used the threat of that furnace to try to, like I say, melt off the old ways and stamp his name on them and his title, his likeness on people, because he was so used to putting that everywhere else. I mean, there's just a great line in this story. This conversation between the three men and Nebuchadnezzar is absolutely fascinating. But it starts out with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego saying, "We have no need to answer you." In other words, we are not answerable to you. You are trying to use this furnace to make us answerable, to control us, to make us sort of bow to your will. And we're not going to do it. Yeah. We answer to a higher power. So we can have this conversation, but ultimately our loyalty is to God and not to you.
Yeah, that's really good. And then, of course, we know Daniel is all about Daniel. Where is he?
Yeah,
did he bow? And we don't. What's going on with him?
Yeah, my suspicion is he doesn't bow, but I do not have an answer to the question, where is Daniel? I remember as a kid wondering how did he skate on this thing? How did he get off and not have to bow down? And we read at the end of chapter 2 that Daniel remained at the royal court. To me, it seems like he's like at ground zero of this, and he should be involved. Now, maybe he was away on vacation. Maybe he had been dispatched as an emissary to another country. We're just not sure, but this is not a story in which Daniel plays an important role.
Right.
And we were just talking very briefly as well, April, about how the fact of Daniel as a sequence is a little bit confusing, and scholars suggest that maybe this isn't a perfect chronology, and some of these chapters were stories that were individual, and then they kind of got gathered and put together in this sequence.
Sure.
But we don't know for a fact it's chronological.
Right.
So what happens at the end of chapter 2 doesn't mean that's absolutely what's happening at the beginning of chapter 3.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. And the other thing that I get a lot of questions for with just young kids is, what about the fourth person there in the furnace?
Yeah.
I asked my small group if what they were taught as kids, angel, pre-incarnate Christ, who is the fourth man? So what is your take on that?
Yeah, we did a series at our church a number of months ago called He's Been Here Before. And this was a series in which we talked about Old Testament Christophanies, which are appearances like to Abraham, perhaps to Hagar, of maybe Jesus himself appearing in the Old Testament. Like God the Father said, all right, God the Son, you're going in on this one, something like that,
Right.
which is just like a cool thing. Nebuchadnezzar says here in verse 25, I see four men walking around, unbound and unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods. That doesn't mean anything in particular what he thinks it looks like. To me, it's far more important that he can walk around in a fire and he can come and go as he pleases.
Yeah.
To me, as a Christian, I would say I got a really strong sense that this is Jesus. If I was reading this as a Jewish person today, I would say maybe it's the angel of God, something like that. And the angel of the Lord and the Lord, some of these stories like with Manoah, that title kind of blends back and forth. It was some supernatural visitor there to both encourage the three men in the furnace and also, I think, to testify to Nebuchadnezzar, again, that there was a higher power than he that was interacting and intersecting with the lives of those three men.
Right. That's really good. So when we think about this chapter, you talked a lot about us as well, that we are not supposed to conform. Talk a little bit about the difference maybe between conforming on the outside versus conforming on the inside. Even maybe we could talk slightly about in Revelation, it talks about the mark of the beast, and we might be called to conform or else at that time. Just a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's an old story preachers like to tell about the Sunday school student who refused to sit down at the table when the lesson was supposed to start. And his teacher says, Johnny, sit down. And he won't sit down. So Johnny, sit down. And he won't sit down. In fact, he's like, Johnny, if you don't sit down, then I'm going to tell your parents, not to take you to the circus this weekend. And so little Johnny sits down and he says, well, I'm sitting down on the outside, but on the inside, I'm still standing up.
Yeah.
Like I still have this defiance inside. And one of the things I wonder about is, can it work in reverse where you can do the wrong thing on the outside, but then on the inside still have a heart of faithfulness toward God? And I think that's kind of the question. Can you, as it were, go through the motions to do something wrong while inside you're still yielded to Jesus? I suppose that theoretically that's possible. I don't like how the mind-body dichotomy or spirit embodiment dichotomy seems to be at work there. I suppose it's philosophically possible. We always talk about it going the other way, of course, where you can go through the motions, but inside be sort of rebelling against God. For me, in this story, it becomes relevant because I really believe that one of Nebuchadnezzar's big concerns, he seems to be enraged at them, is how standing up would have been received and read by other of his administrators there. Now it says a group of Chaldeans tattled on them, but I just wonder if Nebuchadnezzar thought, okay, if those guys don't really bow down, there's going to be other people who don't bow down. And it could become this wave against my agenda. And so whether or not it's philosophically or theologically possible, I think it's awesome that they refuse to say, well, we'll bow down on the outside, but our loyalty is to God on the inside, because of the witness that it had on the outside by standing up.
Yeah. And maybe that's a really good thing for us to know as well, that it's not, yes, we do talk about our heart a lot of times, but sometimes it is really important what is actually happening on the outside because of the witness it leaves to other people.
God can see our hearts, but other people do not have that advantage.
Right.
And they would have seen Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and made assumptions about their hearts that were not true. So thankfully, they bravely stood tall.
Right. So with that, how can we realize when we are bowing down to the culture or things that we probably shouldn't be bowing down to? How do we recognize ourselves when we are conforming in ways that we shouldn't be?
Yeah. Well, I think it's easier for me to answer that sort of in the positive case than the negative case. I would say we know best what to do by conforming to the pattern of Christ. Yeah. And so there will always be new innovations in the wrong things that the world wants us to do. And we can kind of, bat those away and address those. Or we can have a pathway that says, I'm going to focus on the Gospels. I'm going to look at how Jesus lived his life under the pressures that he faced. I'm going to look at the way that someone like Paul interprets some of these actions of Jesus in the world. And to me, it's an easier measuring stick to say, how am I aligned with Jesus, as opposed to how am I slaying the demons of my age? So
Right.
my advice to people who wonder about that is, absolutely tune in to how Jesus reacted in his age, when he's before the Sanhedrin, when his family is trying to get him to quiet down because he's annoying people in Capernaum from their perspective, and he
Yeah.
won't. So how do we remain faithful to the mission God has given to us, as
Hmm.
Christ was faithful to the mission God had given to him?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Now, what about those of us who, when we hear this message with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the only thing that goes through our minds is that we were in something similar, and we did the wrong thing. We messed up.
Yeah.
What do you say to those people that feel like if they were in that position, they wouldn't do the right thing, or they have done the wrong thing in the past?
Yeah, it's easier again for me to answer the second part. I think I would say to someone like that, join the club. I mean, as a pastor, I have done things I wish I could do over again. I have fallen into conformity when I wish I could have stood out. But that's part of being a person who has a bent toward doing what is wrong. We don't have a 100% track record. And the church is a place where we gather and say, yeah, I dropped the ball. I gave in too easily. I quit when I should have hung tough. And I'm here because I need Jesus. When we are faithless, he is faithful. And so, one of the amazing things about being a Christian is that Jesus gives his faithfulness to us in the eyes of God.
Right.
And so, God looks at you and thinks, April, you were faithful all the way through, because what was true of Jesus is given over to you. And Jesus receives the due punishment of someone who is unfaithful on
Yeah.
your behalf. There's this great exchange. And so church is about naming that, owning that, taking off the pretense, taking off the mask, receiving grace in communion and the word and prayer and people laying hands on you, and then worshiping in gratitude. Like, in God's eyes, it's as if I had never done that,
Yeah.
because his love covers
Mhm.
all those things through Jesus.
Right.
So don't be too discouraged. But at the same time, I think part of the process of sanctification, as we call it, is being able to say, okay, here are some places where I tend to get tripped up, where I didn't see it coming last time, but this time I'm going to be careful. I'm going to be more aware. And again, trying to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, rather than trying to just deal with all of the other voices that come from all around the world,
Right.
trying to get us to do things other than fall into his pattern.
Right. And one thing with that, with being strong, is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, there were 3 of them, and that's one of the ways that we can be strong, is
Right.
to bring people along with us to help us be
Yeah.
strong.
Yeah, I think it's Solomon who says a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken.
Right.
And so I'm sure that those 3 talked it over, encouraged one another, and prayed together and said, we're in this together.
Yeah.
And yeah, the amazing thing is it turned out not to be 3, it turned out to be 4.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. So we have the next message in our series. Can you say just a tiny snippet about what's coming up?
Yeah. And so Pastor Mark will be sharing in our next message, which is from Daniel 4. And this is Nebuchadnezzar. Interesting. He has this dream of a tree being cut down, and it's a stump, and then he's come to find out that this is a picture of him as he is taken off of his throne for a season, and he goes through a time of we're just kind of wandering in the field on hands and knees, and he's sort of like this beastly form. Really an interesting story, and it just brings to mind this problem with Daniel in that Nebuchadnezzar never seems to ultimately have the lessons that he learns take hold.
Yeah.
He goes from proud to humbled, but then he sort of goes back to being proud again. And then he's humbled and he goes back to being proud again.
Yeah.
And so Nebuchadnezzar is kind of what not to do. And people like Daniel and Abednego are more models of how we should behave.
Yeah. Well, that sounds good. And I'm looking forward to the next time we get together.
All right. We'll see you then.
Okay.